The year is 2008. You've just downloaded a couple of rock bangers from a sketchy website that turned up as a search result for skilled free download MP3 to your single gigabyte storage player. Somewhere in the new and hot songs for people with exquisite taste just like you section, a song called Burn It to the Ground by the band called Nickelback catches your eye. After just a brief moment of deliberation, you press download, and just 5 newly opened ad tabs and 20 minutes of the download time later, you are just rocking to this absolute bop. And the only question that now occupies your not yet fully developed mind is, who are these bad boys? What is Nickelback? After 5 minutes of vigorous research, you see the word you've never heard before being thrown here and there. The word is post-grunge. As a sophisticated music connoisseur, you find yourself not having the slightest idea what grunge and, let's be honest, post means, but you are intrigued. And here your journey begins.
It's not like you to say sorry. I was waiting on a different story. If I go crazy, then will you still call me Superman? With arms wide open under the sunlight, and I am aware now of how everything's gonna be fine.
Over the years, post-grunge managed to get notoriety as contestably the worst rock subgenre of all times. If you are someone like me and were old enough to have unrestricted internet access somewhere in the aughts, chances are you too have some nostalgic feelings towards some of the bands, or at least some of the songs that came from the bands who fell wholly or partially into this genre category. And say anything you want, some of early 3 Days Grace slaps, and you have neither taste nor soul if you think otherwise. I'm not biased by nostalgia. Before we go any further, we must first try to define post-grunge, and that is where our problems begin. Like any genre of music that has a post prefix in it, post-grunge has to be defined to a large extent by its opposition and resemblance to the original, the grunge genre. The grunge itself is pretty hard to define musically. It's usually described as incorporating elements of punk rock and heavy metal with some climbing indie rock to be one of the major inspiration sources, with sludgier, distorted guitar-infused sound and lyrics often addressing themes such as social alienation, self-doubt, abuse, neglect, betrayal, social and emotional isolation, addiction, psychological trauma, and a desire for freedom. I mean, it's hard to imagine a more vague definition. As much as critics and music nerds tried to pinpoint the essence of grunge, it's telling how little the major grunge bands Nirvana, Alice in Chains, Pearl Jam, and Soundgarden have in common, with band members actually actively disclaiming their relation to the genre at various points in time.
And now I saw some reviews of the record, and one of them was the Boston Globe said, the grunge, the new record shows the grunge still holds up. And I'm curious whether you think of yourself as a grunge band? Is that label
never did. Never thought of that word grunge. That's just a marketing ploy. That's like calling it, this is detergent, Grunge was a fucking word used in TV commercials about scum on your shower curtain.
If even Rolling Stone can't define it, nobody probably can. How the New York Times article from 1992 by Rick Marin describes the roots of the term. In 1988, a Seattle record label called Sub Pop released a 3-box set called Sub Pop 200. It was a compilation of bands like Nirvana, Soundgarden, and Mudhoney. And it came complete with a 20-page booklet backed with pictures by Charles Peterson, the photographer credited with creating grunge's hair, sweat, and guitarist look. Sub Pop also sent a catalog to the nation's alternative rock intelligentsia, describing its band's punk metal guitar noise as grunge, the first documented use of the now ubiquitous term. Culturally, grunge encapsulated the alternative, anti-consumerist, anti-establishment spirit of the youth. Basically, more than anything else, grunge was a vibe, and by the time post-grunge rolled around, the vibe was off. The worst genre of all times discourse is not at all surprising given the fact that the term post-grunge was originally pejorative. The post prefix was a representation of emerging bands or labels that signed them attempts to mimic what grunge looked like in an attempt to garner a similar cultural impact. The term basically encapsulated the mocking of forcefully raspy, aggressive vocals and blatantly straightforward lyrics packaged with unassuming melodies that mimicked grunge with the purpose of repeating its commercial success. Deriving from grunge, post-grunge was to some extent defined by a much more polished, plastic and radio-friendly production quality. The core of the post-grunge hate is in the way the very origin of the term doomed it from the start. As opposed to other genres with the post prefix, it was added to grunge mockingly to signify how genre derives from grunge without bringing anything new to it. Like post-hardcore adds a more creative and usually melodically sophisticated twist to hardcore punk, and post-punk has little to nothing in common with punk rock. And post-grunge basically meant grunge but shittier, and the term was originally used almost ironically. Given the vagueness of the original term grunge and the aversion the artist labeled as such felt towards the genre, it's kind of funny how we got to we don't know what exactly it was, so we don't know what it was supposed to evolve into, but we can say with certainty that we don't like what it did evolve into. Basically, we don't know what it should have become, but not that. Some say that the existence of the genre signified the shift from original spirit of not just grunge, but rock music in general, that was traditionally supposed to be a counterpart to corporatized consumerism culture. To be fair, the same can be and was said about numerous other bands and genres that watered down alternative sound to make it appealing to a broader audience. For instance, grunge is often viewed as a response to commercialized alternative genres with the pop-influenced sound like glam metal, also lovingly called hair metal. The main critique thrown at post-grunge seems to be, in its most condensed form, the bands seemingly imitating the aesthetic superficially without having much substance to ground it in. In more subjective terms, part of the core of the critique is that post-grunge bands just didn't have much to say. They lacked depth, and when you listen to a post-grunge song, it felt like there wasn't a lot they stood behind, at least compared to grunge artists. It's enough for us to compare Pearl Jam's trilogy centered around the story of a serial killer that, among other things, touches on the topic of domestic abuse, to Nickelback unapologetically rhyming sorry with story in a hook for a song about, you guessed it, a heartbreak. It's worth noting that this context of the comparison to grunge is crucial for this superficiality criticism. After all, if we want to criticize music for the lack of depth and overuse of simple, uncontroversial, universally understood themes, we might as well start with throwing a rock at 99% of pop music ever written. Let's put a pin in that one. Despite my previous confessions of nostalgic affection to some of the genre representatives, when I listen to some of the songs I was obsessed with when I was 14, especially now that I can speak English a little, I can't deny that they just don't hit the same. It's impossible to ignore the blunt straightforwardness of both lyrics and music. Regardless of whether or not the song is good, or to make it more specific, pleasant to listen to, in the majority of cases, the guitar riffs are predictable somehow, the melody is catchy and unassuming, and the lyrics feel square, often as though they are optimized for a specific purpose. When researching for this video, I decided to re-listen to 3 Days Grace's first 3 albums to see how I feel about them 12 years later. And I was surprised by how in your face a lot of the lyrics are. I mean, look at those. It's not that the music is bad for what it is, accessible, edgy pop rock, but it's almost as though the lyrics are specifically tailored to be understood by a 14-year-old. Which is not surprising given the fact that the first 3 albums have been recorded with a major label that also signs artists like Britney Spears and Backstreet Boys. And it's independent subsidiary. It seemed like having mainstream appeal as a goal was actually embraced by at least some genre ambassadors. For instance, Nickelback vocalist Chet Kroeger, as NotableBiographies.com puts it, emerged not only as a frontman on stage and on record, but also as a sort of a musical entrepreneur, a calculating businessman, and songwriter. Reporters noted that the members of Nickelback started managing themselves between their first and second albums, with Chet Kroeger tracking radio airplay of their songs. Interviewers often found him talking at length about how he had studied what makes a popular song a hit. "I study everything," he told Karen Bliss of Canadian Musician. "I started studying every piece. Everything sonically, everything lyrically, everything musically, chord structure. I would dissect every single song that I would hear on the radio or every song that had ever done well on a chart, and I would say, why did this do well?" Nickelback's single How You Remind Me, Kroeger told Bliss, sold so well because it was about romantic relationships, a universal subject, and contained 3 memorable hooks, including the, and I quote, "yes," after the chorus. Regardless of whether or not other post-grunge band frontmen were as open about having mainstream success as their goal, or even consciously shared it, the end product kinda speaks for itself. And if we assume the desire to have a broader mainstream appeal, on the lyrics side, what's more antithetical to mainstream success than strong political stances? An interesting pattern I noticed in a lot of interviews with post-grunge bands is a sort of an overarching apolitical sentiment. Outside of few exceptions like Skillet's frontman Boomer screeching about the woke ideology, the narrative you often hear is along the lines of, we don't choose political sides. And even when bands do make political statements, it's usually diluted to, I wish we could all just get along level of discourse. I personally relate that with the substantial overlap post-grunge has with Christian rock, at least to some extent. Post-grunge is a genre predominantly known and created in the west of the global north, where no matter how much some Christians try to make it seem otherwise, being a Christian places you into a privileged position of the religious and cultural majority, and creating music with clear Christian themes while also borrowing from a genre that is defined by questioning and defying the status quo comes with its inherent contradictions. Those contradictions usually force you to make a tough choice. You can go the skillet route and imagine systemic obstacles to rally against for the social group you represent where there aren't any, to artificially maintain that rebellious spirit. But that comes with the downside of alienating a good chunk of your audience, previous or potential, who don't share your political views. A more lucrative option is to actually embrace the contradiction of piggybacking off a countercultural movement without contributing much substance, mimicking grunge superficially while trying to remain palatable for as many people as possible. Such an approach is definitely preferable if you are targeting a wider audience and aim to make art that is first and foremost accessible. The downside is obviously the limits that places on the themes and ideas you can explore in your music, and as a consequence, the reputation you or your band garner for yourself. You can't really expect to make your songs as palatable as possible without being called a spineless corporate shell. This downside becomes especially apparent when we are talking about the genre that supposedly takes its roots in one of the most prominent countercultural, anti-consumerist, and anti-corporate artistic movements of the 90s. Although I personally don't particularly enjoy art that is framed as apolitical by its creators, I am aware that there's a huge demand for it. There's nothing wrong with preferring art that centers, let's say, an artist's emotional world over that which talks about social injustices. And obviously, a lack of political stance does not necessarily make art bad. Nevertheless, I can't really say that people's disdain for this aspect of post-grunge music, especially grunge fans' disdain, is unwarranted. It's probably disheartening to see the grunge legacy, with Nirvana explicitly telling bigots they aren't welcome at their concerts, just as an example, being turned into a spineless, let's just all get along and buy my merch. Speaking of Nirvana and going against the mainstream, I think that's something a lot of creative struggles with, wanting to be recognized and share your art, yet despising being conventionally appealing.
It's not just being funny, It's being proud of your stuff and doing things that other people couldn't do. And it started really screwing with me. Are we allowed to just go out there and be funny?
What does that mean?
Well, it worries me. I feel that it's cheating just go out there. I think anyone can be funny.
What? What are you talking about?
Because I feel guilty about just being able to make people laugh. I want them to go, that wasn't just luck, he worked on that bit and I couldn't come up with that. Because I'm also conscious about comedians who go out there and they're anodyne and safe and they say things we could all think.
There's this weird aversion to having art be understood and appreciated by the mainstream, coming from artists themselves, but also from the fandom and the critics. To be valuable, art is expected to walk the fine line between being liked enough as to not be completely relevant and not being liked too much by too many people, as that makes it primitive and for the masses. This narrative is often perpetuated both by the artist and the fan. After all, if my art or the art that I like can be understood and appreciated even by people who I believe are stupid and have no taste, what does it say about me? If both them and me, an intellectual, can have fun listening to Smells Like Teen Spirit or, God forbid, How You Remind Me, maybe we aren't that different after all. I initially wanted to include something like the rise and fall of post-grunge either in the name or the thumbnail of the video, but changed my mind, not only because this video isn't supposed to document the evolution or downfall of post-grunge or do a historical deep dive, but also because I'm not sure it fell. Like many other music phenomena that, at least from the label's perspective, aimed at capitalizing off of a polished imitation of an alternative genre, it kind of just faded into a relative irrelevance, with most of the more popular bands making a mix of post-grunge with alternative or hard rock, leaning heavily into the latter and often fully abandoning the former. It would be silly to treat the phenomenon of post-grunge as any sort of uniquely vile instance of corporatization of an underground movement. From that New York Times article we touched on earlier, we have a big role in spreading something from the underground to the heartland, said John Kennelly, the senior vice president of music and talent at MTV. But a band playing at the heartland isn't underground anymore, which explains why, Mr. Kennelly said, we're always looking for whatever the next thing is. From glam metal to pop punk to mumble rap, within the economic system where endless and preferably exponential economic growth is a vital requirement, commercial labels will always be looking for the next niche gem to water down and profit off of. Did I mention that we do be living in a society? But no matter what critics say, don't let snobs and haters rob you of the pleasure of singing along to How You Remind Me. Thank you for watching. I hope you like this nostalgia-fueled video. Let me know what you think of post-grunge as a phenomenon and of post-grunge artists. Do you like any of them? Did you like any of them as a teen, perhaps? And yeah, like, honestly, the 3 Days Grace vocalist. Yeah, my 13 years old ass was there for the music, totally. Like the video if you liked it, subscribe for a new, completely unrelated one, and have a nice day. I'm in my basic beach attire talking about the alternative music. Get you a girl who can do both. I'm not like other girls. I listen to Skillets.